This week I'm joined once again by independent Rudolf Steiner scholar Dale Brunsvold to continue our discussion on the work of Rudolf Steiner. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support the podcast, gain access to some exclusive content, or just keep everything running, then please find links for the Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Dale Brunsvold, thanks very much once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, we are, as people can imagine, because no conversation on Steiner is really going to cover his full work, we're going to have a second part here on the work of Rudolf Steiner after the extremely popular, just so you know, Dale, extremely popular first part that we did, that many people really enjoyed and have got a lot of really great feedback on. But of course, if that is their first introduction to Steiner, it's sort of like, yeah, people were saying, oh, there's so much packed in it. There was so much packed in it. And I'm thinking, yeah, there was, but not even the tip of the iceberg. So we have to do this part two. It's difficult to say really where we left off because with Steiner, everything's sort of this synthesis and things do connect together. And that was the big question that we left out and didn't really have time for last time, which is this extremely important thing for Steiner, which is the synthesis of science and spirituality, which seems, in a way, for many people, for people who are sort of orthodox on both sides, scientists and those who are perhaps more traditionally religious, it seems anathema to synthesize the two. Often people like to separate these things. So just to really open up with this very broad question, what is Steiner's purpose with this idea of synthesizing science and spirituality?
James, I hadn't realized how rich that question was until you described it really so beautifully. It absolutely is the case, isn't it? That religion is very upset hearing scientific formed ideas bearing down on their sacrosanct ideas. And science maybe is even more angry because they're really the powerhouse of the world, that you would bring anything in from the some spiritual craziness to invest into the phenomena of the natural world. Oh, that's impossible kind of thing. Yeah. And that is a struggle, isn't it? And it might be one of the reasons Steiner is just sort of set aside, even given the astonishing amount of rich, pragmatic, practical results that his work has given. And they do begrudgingly, right, admit that that's true of them, but they don't go deeper. There's no way they're going to go deeper. Yeah. So Steiner really is saying that science left to itself can't really take hold of what's approaching us now. That the complexities of the earth and these things we're sort of being called upon by all the crises around us, in my opinion, from Steiner's work, to change our consciousness so that we're bringing in a larger panorama of actual data, but now not only based on the physical organs of perception, but these other organs of perception that live in the bodies that we talked about last time. I hope we talked about them. I don't remember all the details. So that we would have astral organs of perception that would begin objectively now, because science has done this thing to our souls, and we really should be grateful for that, however problematic its existence is now, right? But that the astral information, let's call it that, kind of a grotesque way of saying it, but okay, gives us more for our thinking life to take hold of and integrate and understand. Our etheric organs of perception give us, again, more to integrate and understand. And he felt that once we have then really a richer, more holistic, literal perception of the world, that so many things will occur. A much more natural harmonization between people will occur. A harmonizing with the earth will occur. We can see these things, for instance, I think, at least in the beginnings of Waldorf education. What is education going to look like when people are aspiring to a deeper picture of the human being, even if they themselves don't necessarily have those capacities yet? What about agriculture? How do we work with agriculture so that we're healing the earth rather than just jamming nitrogens and all these substances into the soil and bathing our crops in poisons in order to ripen them faster so we can eat them quicker, and all these types of things, right? These are all scientific ideas, right, in that sense, right? So in that, then, we just do get a synthesis of science and spirituality, because the astral world is the spiritual world, the etheric world is the spiritual world, right? And once that data, once that perceptual content enters into this consciousness that we should aspire to, we will have a new picture of the world. But you know what? It will actually be what Steiner called, James, right? Spiritual science. So he really wanted science as it was to be as it was, and then extend it, to broaden it, to bring it to what he called spiritual science or anthroposophy. So. How's that sound to begin?
I think it's a hell of a beginning. Of course, loads of questions from that. I mean, one thing I'll bring in. I'll just see what you make of it, and see if this fits within the Steinerian picture of things. Recently, I was doing some talks on meditations on the tarot, the book anonymously written, but they think it was written by Valentin Tomberg. I don't know if you've come across it.
Sure, yeah. And it was written by him.
Yeah. And he gives this definition between science and spirituality, actually, which I've found very helpful, which is that spirituality, or for him, of course, he's sort of writing with this very Catholic Christian emphasis, is that you have this revelation, you have the divine that comes down from the above to the below, and then once that's in the below via a prophet or via the writing, via scripture, you then use that to then go back up and build your laws from that. Whereas what he's saying is that science doesn't begin from any of that. It actually begins from the below just on its own, and then sort of creates its own false above. So would that be what Steiner sees science doing when it just acts by itself and draws all its lines and says, look, we don't want to know about other things, we just want to know about this empirical, validated, tested things that we're doing down here?
Well, I think that is that natural modality and form of our consciousness, right? We are a materialistic age. It's perhaps the most complete separation from the spiritual world. Again, giving that its due, right? That's ever existed. I sometimes thought lately of all the hierarchies as they came into being throughout history, the angels and the archangels and everything. It seems it's possible that only the human hierarchy that is coming into being now has been actually completely separated from the spiritual world. And in that modality is creating something that has never existed in all of creation in terms of freedom, and in terms of, through freedom, an actual love that's not kind of bathed in the glory and grace of the Godhead, but is, though it is as well, of course, but is really created out of some kernel in us that came out of this extreme darkness that the separation from the Godhead occurred. So that's that side of it. But I want to ask this a question from you. So when he says a false above, that the science has created a false above, I just don't know what you meant by that. Could you expand on that?
So the way he understands this is that science doesn't begin from something that's been revealed to us from above. So it doesn't begin from, say, revelation or scripture, or say, for instance, the above comes down. It's imbued in someone who is open to it, such as an apostle, a prophet, someone who's very open to the above. They then write it or teach it, and that's how it gets sort of spread through to the masses. So there's sort of a dissension, which is really an ascension. But whereas science, it doesn't have anything like that that's actually been revealed to it. So it begins solely from the human point of view, and then its own above is it begins just from this empirical below, and then it develops things that it calls laws, which then after a long time it says, right, now this is a principle, and so then its above is all these principles and laws, which is only ever really made from the below. And it wasn't something that was revealed in a sort of divine way, but that's something that was sort of wrestled out from human perception alone.
Isn't that subtle? Yeah, that's very subtle. Subtle argument. Yeah. Sure. I think that was part of, so that is science. You just described science right there, right, in a nutshell. And Steiner would then say, or did say, that was the darkness we went through. That was the tempering of the soul. So before that time, exactly, you had the prophets, and you had people. In fact, before the prophets, you had entire cultures, Steiner says, right, that were naturally clairvoyant. And in this natural clairvoyance that an entire culture had, so it didn't even think about the fact that elemental spirits and angels and archangels or whatever were around them. It was as natural as you and I looking out and seeing trees and grass and going, and not thinking twice about it. Who writes that down? So So they were in that modality, but in that modality of that kind of clairvoyance, their consciousness was filled with the presence of spiritual beings. And in some ways, they were coerced in a certain kind of way, or almost like a hive of activity, you could say, that we see now and look back at pyramids and stuff like that and think, what an intelligent individual created that. And Steiner would say, no, there was an intelligence that was really there, but it lived in these people in a very different way from what you and I would imagine now. And this has to do with that, the evolution of consciousness that's been occurring. Okay, and this is a flabbergasting idea to take in. Believe me, I think about it all the time. Is that really true? Is our understanding of history that bad? That's a bad. If we take our modality of consciousness and just stick it back 5,000-10,000 years ago and say everybody was that way as we are, they were just stupid. That's just that's the conceit of a scientific orientation, by the way, as well, right? So what happened then is, as the fall continued, it didn't happen in one moment, right? The fall is this receding of the spiritual beings that were involved in our consciousness more and more. And as they did, the vacancy, the void that produced in our consciousness began to be filled up with the experiences of our senses. You might say that we desperately reached out for those sense experiences because of the void we were having inside of us. I'm thinking of like people that are trapped in those lily ponds, right? And they would drive them insane because they wouldn't give them any physical stimuli, right? And some of those horror stories kind of thing. You know what lily ponds are?
Yeah.
Those sense deprivation tanks.
Oh, okay. No.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. If you can drive someone insane because you shut off their ability to have their senses filled with information, and this emptiness arises in us. Okay, so just to give that picture. So as that occurs, then, and we kind of reach into the physical world and draw in these sense perceptions, we take hold of them in a far more vigorous and serious way than we did when the spiritual beings were filling our consciousness all the time. And then we began to understand, to relate, to codify, to conceptualize in a very serious manner. And this really hit its sweet spot, Steiner said, in 1413, with the beginnings of the consciousness soul era, even though we have, of course, the wonderful cultures of Greece and Rome. But it was at that time that it really took over, you might say, almost all of mankind, humanity. And science and stuff just went nuts from then on, as it were. So the point is I'm not really disagreeing with Tomberg, except I'm wondering why. So he's seeing these as parallel. Okay, I'm kind of asking a question. So he's seeing these as parallel lines, and it's really the religious that's more important. Steiner's saying, no, now that science has created what it's created, through the work we'll do in our inner lives, we will now bring science, art, and religion back into one whole eventually as time goes on. And that will just happen because of the richer and richer experiences we'll start to have as we do these exercises and these contemplations. So that but it was and it wasn't the fruits. Okay, so it wasn't so much the fruits of science that we're looking at right now from Steiner's point of view, but in the more Eastern-oriented sense of the striving, this new striving of the scientific orientation that changed the life of the soul. And it changed the life of the soul into a certain objectivity that when it enters back into the spiritual world, it won't just be taken up by that world and lost in it. It will stay its own entelechy, its own individuality in that world. It will be a being of a new hierarchy. Now, I don't think Tomberg, and it is baffling to me why he left anthroposophy, right? A part of it was, yes, the cold aspects and attitudes of anthroposophists. Steiner had died. And also, I think he was quite I can read in his work, he was an incredibly deep man. And I don't think he got the respect that he felt he deserved from them, that they didn't recognize his greatness might be a trivial way of saying it. And so that might have been also one, can't psychologize the reason because I really don't know, but I've always been baffled why Tomberg separated from the society, because that was his beginning. That was everything. That gave him everything, I think, in his whole life. And then he found himself in Catholicism instead. But did I answer that question, sir?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I guess one little question would be. I mean, for Steiner, could there even be such a thing as sort of science by itself? For him, real science has to have this holistic connection to all these other things. Otherwise, is it something else entirely for him?
Well, it'll become a kind of form of evil, right? What won't it? I mean, in a certain sense, what are we already saying? Science, in one of its trajectories, is saying, yes, wow, consciousness, it's just electrical
Hmm.
activity in the brain. Well, okay, well, so is the activity in a computer. It's only electrical activity in the chips. So why not somehow fuse the two and just transfer this thing we call consciousness into machines, right? That's, think of it now, that's
Hmm.
just sort of a common sense extrapolation of one picture of scientific understanding. Would you agree with that?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's chilling to me, right?
Hmm.
But and that's the idea of an immortality then, and all these kinds of things that come out of that. So you could say that if science, let's just say this, and I don't know if Steiner really ever said it as brusquely as I am, but if science continues in its way, it'll become an objective evil in the world.
Hmm.
You know, the like Steiner says, this is so fascinating. He says, really, the golden thread, the blessing that the good gods gave humanity to keep it connected to its evolution, was death. That death is what constantly allows us to extricate ourselves from our physical organism, enter back into the spiritual world, enter into communion with the hierarchies, rebuild a new spiritual seed that we will then use for our next incarnation, et cetera, right? And think of it, what we want to do is we want to stay completely on the physical plane. That's where it's at. And we need immortality there. That's pure Ahriman. That's the purest picture of Ahriman you could imagine.
Mm. And it's
Okay.
and also we tend to, on that physical plane, we put all our efforts really in, even for young people now who aren't suffering and aren't close to death, put all their efforts in the ignorance, in willfully ignoring, death and suffering, which are really in that same vein of mortality.
Yeah, they're a bad thing. You see, we've got to
Mm.
fix that. No aging. Yeah, no aging. I'm going to go in and Botox my face into, you know what I mean? It's all become totally superficial, totally the surface of things. Now, I don't know why that's happened, because I wouldn't think science would only want the surface of things. Obviously, it's a very, very deep. And Steiner, fell over himself in appreciation of science. It's given us a soul that can know the spiritual world now in a higher and purer way than has ever been true of all the prophets of the past.
Mm. Mm.
So he's claiming, right? And seemingly, in my opinion, a magnificent example of it too. Right? So it is, right? So those two things coming together. Now it's, I don't know, and I'm going to have to say this, that I've heard, and though it's more anecdotal, that even religion, if it stays on its path and doesn't really uh, grow, doesn't really evolve and change, will also have a very problematic existence in the future too. I don't want to say out and out evil, but a worrisome thing will be happening there as well.
Mm.
So it's this synthesis has to happen, and you could say, anthroposophy ultimately is a force of healing. It's not a set of abstract ideas. It's not a dogma to be believed. Steiner says once this elixir of life starts to work in us through good practical work and good practical meditation, it's only a healing thing.
Mm.
And I feel that more and more. I don't know that's true, but I do. It feels right to me.
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, there's a really big thing that you brought in that I'm so in agreement with you. I think you mentioned this crises, and it makes me think. A lot of people talk about the crises of modernity or the crises of the modern world, and they tend to relate this back to Nietzsche. The infamous death of God. But really, could we say that Steiner once again goes one further, and he says, no, this is a death of consciousness. When we think about the great chain of being with Aquinas, or other people have their own forms of, as you've already mentioned, hierarchical understanding of a being, a being that can evolve. And this is language that's used by many mystics or spiritualists. The crisis really is one of the death of consciousness, right? Consciousness is slowly becoming less full.
Very nice. That's good. I really like that. I mean, I don't like that. I like that. But
Yeah, I would
yes,
agree with
well
yeah.
said. Actually, well said. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know if we go past its proper time, right? What did Steiner say evil was? Steiner said evil is something that was good at one time that has persisted into a time when it's inappropriately existing.
Wow.
And in that inappropriate existing, it manifests in that culture, in that new time, as evil. So that's very interesting, right? So, for instance, he would say that about atavistic forms of consciousness, where we use channeling, where we give up the ego that has been bequeathed by the Christ, you might say, and want to go back into, you might say, these more ecstasy-oriented forms of consciousness. We can possibly get information through those. We can learn things through those. He says the problem is you aren't there. You aren't in the midst of it existentially as a moral agency.
Mm.
And that's gradually just going to become more and more decadent if we don't battle against that. That's that's controversial, I know, because there's channeling is in vogue. It's still right there. So tell me more about the death of consciousness.
Well,
It's a good one. I like it.
well, it's I think I mean, I'm sort of drawing in Gurdjieff, drawing in Uspensky,
Okay,
but I mean,
sure.
and also, I mean, I think it's found in all spiritual paths. You have to, if there's some sort of form of enlightenment, this idea of, in a certain sense, moving from darkness to light, or growing, or evolving, there has to be not so much as a form of superiority, which is, I think, is often how a lot of people misconceive it. They think, oh, you think because you've grown, you're better. I don't think it's that. It's more, Aquinas, he did call it a fullness of being. So it's not a superiority, it's an intensification in that vertical way, a greater relationship with the above. And so I think one of the things that's often missed with this idea of a hierarchy of being, of, Gurdjieff says, get out of sleep to waking sleep, to self-remembering, and then to conscious man. And if we have in the Thomistic tradition of minerals to plants to animals to man to angels to archangels to God, between within man is levels of being. We've all met people who are more conscious, more
Yes.
attentive, more there. And I think one of the things which is criminally, in a way, overlooked, probably because people just don't want to admit to it, is that often we say, oh yeah, here's the hierarchy, the levels of growth. But I would always say, and this is the thing that I think people miss out, is that implicitly, if you're implying that there is a potential for growth, then there is inherently a potential for degrowth and for dissension. And I think that's what's really been happening since, with the crisis of modernity, is quite literally a consciousness which is on a collective level heading back towards sleep. And, you've mentioned that thousands and thousands of years ago, the collective consciousness was one which was more attuned to gods. These weren't hallucinations. People had rituals. People were far more, in tune with something higher, probably because they didn't have to look at screens and be bombarded with modern noise all day. And I think the way that we're heading is quite literally toward, one instance of this, I think, is that we are seeing more and more people who quite literally do not have an internal monologue. And I think that is spiritually an absolutely terrifying thought, that we could be moving to a point where people's consciousness is destroyed to the point where they're almost just an automaton.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful. No, really. No, I agree, sadly, that's a worry. It is absolutely a worry, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I mean, you think about the emphasis on the body and on sports and these strange activities that of steroids to build your organisms up, and all these things, that the surface is all that matters. And you're right. Where is that inner monologue going to go or have a place if it's just sensational experience after sensational experience after sensational experience all day long? And I've got to have them. I've got to do it this way. Yeah. Yeah. So we have these people like Gurdjieff and Steiner and others that have seemingly come along, yeah, and not accidentally, in some kind of cosmic plan to hopefully start an awakening process, or to battle against these tendencies of, you could think of it as animalism too, couldn't you? This animality, because our astral body, right, is part of the animal realm, and it has all that in there. And to the degree that we battle against that, and I think the word for battling against that animality in our astral body is called education, right? That if we don't have education, then we will sort of just devolve into this destruction of our consciousness, into something that's just animalistic. And I think we see that in some cases in very scary ways. already. You know what I mean?
But how are you
But
understanding the word? How are you understanding the definition of education?
and and how I'm understanding that is that the sense of self, the sense of the ego, the sense of the I is brought into relation, because it is, animals aren't moral or immoral. They're just, the word doesn't fit, right?
Hmm.
So it's only the human ego in this amazing way that has moral agency. So it's about bringing that moral agency into relationship in the human being, into the physical body and the etheric body and the astral body, right? And that you might say that's what education's always been, even though it's only in Steiner's time that maybe we're becoming more conscious of that. So how do we do that? How do we let we talk about the development of these bodies in the
Yeah,
educational
we
line?
did. I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay. Good. Yeah. So
well,
yeah.
not in relation to education, but we definitely talked about Steiner's understanding. I think in relation to his book on the occult sciences, because it's sort of
Yeah.
needed as the foundation.
Yeah. And so in the world of education, right, they're worried about, well, the etheric body's growing now. So this is what should be happening in the child. So from 1 to 7 years old, or 0 to 7, there's certain things you do and certain things you don't do, so that the etheric body, as it's unfolding its first time in the organism, can do what it wants to do naturally, healthily, right? And then from 7 to 14, you've got the kind of if awakened etheric body, and the astral body is still kind of asleep, but it's gradually waking up, and the teachers are very aware of how to change knowledge into story, change knowledge into imagistic forms that sort of has, you might say, modern knowledge encoded in it, so that the modality of consciousness that the child has at that time stays that way. So we don't go in and go, I'm going to make you as smart as I can, as fast as I can, in my adult understanding of that word. Steiner says, you do that, you're just damaging the human being. If they're not ready, it will happen of itself if you understand what you've got in front of you. Did we talk about this before?
We didn't. I don't think so. No, not this
Okay,
idea of
okay.
it happening by itself. No.
Well, there's an aspect to our unfolding that's true, profound, organic unfolding. Okay. And in that, because we're plastic, because we're human beings, we can get into a child's consciousness at 3 years old and get them learning the alphabet and getting to read. And if they really want to do that completely out of themselves, that's one issue. But if most of the time they don't, most of the time they're imitative sense organs, and they're just absorbing the world in this magnificent way that stuns us to this day, right? How the heck can they learn all they learn so fast, right? And it has to do with the sort of an absence of a consciousness that we think is the one they should have right away. Well, you should be an adult right away. Well, Steiner says, sure, go ahead. If you do that, you're going to rob those etheric forces of what they're naturally doing. And that child's going to get rheumatisms and arthritises and all these things when they're 50 and 60 years old, because you've already begun deforming the creature. That's a pretty wild claim. You know what I'm saying? That's a pretty wild claim. And why? Well, because we don't have a picture of the human being anymore. All we are sacks of chemicals with behaviors, right? And you should be able to do anything with that you want to. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a horrible common sense to science in that regard, right?
Yeah.
If here's science approaching the human being again, and it doesn't know what the human being is, but it's so powerful in itself and so magnificent in its results in the natural world that, of course, they must apply to this other part of the natural world. Well, the problem is the human being isn't the natural world; it's the spiritual world. Now, what do we do?
Yeah,
You know?
I mean, and this makes me think of this quote that I love by Picasso, which I've said on this podcast so many times. But Picasso said, it took me my entire life to paint like a child again.
Nice. Wow.
And I often think about that, in relation to, from Scripture, the idea of come unto the Lord as a little child, and Jesus speaks of his apostles as little children, and that idea of, people obviously, if you read it literally, go, you've got to be a child. It's like, no, it's what you're saying. It's this open, heartfelt, sincere plasticity of the mind, which allows children, or the idea of what it is to be a child in that sense, to truly be open. And as you say, once what Gurdjieff would call personality, or maybe Steiner might call a modern ego, or something of that, once something starts to crystallize in you and confine you, that's when things start to go awry.
Yeah. Yeah. At too early a time too, let's say. I mean, there are these crystallizations, I think, if I'm not misusing your understanding of the word, that are going to occur, right, as they occur in their appropriate moments. What we have when the astral body is born at 14, right?
Yeah.
We have that formal operations thinking that Piaget says just simply starts manifesting. It's an organic unfoldment, right? And there's various kinds of these as we go along that Steiner describes. That are kind of crystallizations, if I'm using that word correctly. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think crystallizations aren't always bad. As
Okay,
Gurdjieff
good.
says, and
Yeah,
as I imagine Steiner would say, you do need certain forms of personality once you get to these levels.
there you go.
Once you get to 14, you need certain new forms of, as you said, structured thinking to even be able to deal with the world. It's not literally being a child.
Yeah, and that is a mysterious phrase. I mean, there is a beautiful lecture by Steiner, and I'm sorry I can't give you where it is, where he talks about the first 3 years of unfoldment, the very magical time, and he says where the Christ being is actually present in those years, and in a very beautiful way, and is involved in these 3 great deeds that occur in the unfolding of a child, and they are this strange orientation of standing vertically, of becoming perpendicular to the earth. Okay, this is a profound thing that's happening, that all the hierarchies in the Christ being are involved in. The human being is, just used almost in that. And then after that, surprisingly, he says speaking happens second, and thinking happens after speaking. Now that's fascinating if you study education and Vygotsky and stuff, who argues that speaking is an organ of cognition in children, that they speak to each other in a way that when you listen to them, you almost don't understand what they're saying if they're doing a group project or something. But somehow after a while, you realize that it's almost its own organ of them seeing what they're doing together. It's really quite fascinating. And so Steiner then says this becoming a child has to do, and I think what were those 3 things you said? Gurdjieff said. He said there's you said self-remembering.
In relation to what? Sorry.
Spiritual development. You said there's 3 things. One of them was self-remembering, and then self-knowing or something. There were these 3.
You begin with self-observation, and then
Self-observation.
So self-observation is quite very sincerely looking inwards. Self-remembering is self-observation, but you're also conscious of yourself in that moment doing it, and beyond that you would sort of be a conscious person. And before all that, there's sort of the morning preparation. I'd say there's 3 stages in a way.
Okay. And then what's after self-remembering?
Well, I think at that point, I think if you could prolong that and stay within that state to a certain degree, you would become a conscious person. Someone who's
gotcha. Yeah.
who is both aware of what they're looking at and aware of themselves looking at what they're looking at. So at no point are they drawn fully into something. They're not identified with the outside world. They're aware of it. They can do what they want, but they're not. They would no longer say, "I am angry," right? They would have an understanding of that. They're not identified with it.
Okay, I got you. Yeah, I was trying to find where Steiner talks about these transformations that happen in his book Knowledge of Higher Worlds, and they're very similar in some ways. So I'm sure, in fact, they're the same if we got right down to it. You know what I mean?
I thought so. Yeah.
They would be. They'd just be kind of different emphases here and there. But yeah.
I'm interested in why standing vertically is before the word. What is that symbolizing for Steiner? What's the importance of that vertical standing for the 1 or 2 year old?
Yeah, it's I mean, I guess because the human being does that. I mean, even though he mentions the exceptions in the animal realm that are not complete but have the orientation toward the vertical. But there's a lot of things that are going on there, and I'm not a real expert at it. But you might say that the human being is the only one that really sacrifices completely to the earth the lower half of their body, so that the upper half of their body becomes free in a complete way. Even apes and those kinds of creatures still use their arms as legs. You know what I mean? They're not really vertical, so they're not. And so in that separation, the higher part of our being actually is exposed to the cosmos and allows this life of thought, you might say, to have the qualities that it has here. And I'm being kind of loosey-goosey here because I don't have a good concrete set of clear concepts on it. But yeah. So I mean, we think about how we lose our consciousness, that we lay, parallel to the earth, and and that's how we become unconscious creatures by and large. So
And
it's a mystery in that regard, right? And sorry I brought it up in such an incomplete way, because it's a little aggravating when I do that. I don't
no,
like to
no,
do
no, no. It's completely fine. I mean, all I was thinking is in relation to that idea of the devolution of consciousness. It's funny how a lot of people are becoming sort of sat down all day, arched
right.
backs, eyes cast down to their phones or to the floor. It's the physicality represents the internal, as
Nice.
always.
Yeah, again, that's a harrowing and true picture. Yeah, even Steiner really did bemoan the sedentary nature of even his own society that was happening. And I never thought about it before. Yeah, when you're sitting, you're really not vertical anymore. So you're like in a dream state or something, staring at the TV screen or your phone or something. Yeah,
Yeah, you're
arg.
allowing the below to just hold you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, which does actually bring me. I mean, managed to segue here somewhat, not so clumsily, but this. So you mentioned there that Steiner bemoaned the fact that they were the sedentary nature of things, and this is where I want to bring in something that you mentioned quite a few times in the first talk. We didn't have an opportunity to really open on it, and I got the impression that this is something of Steiner's that you're really fond of, but it's the agriculture. So this idea of I bring this in with the Steiner schools and the Steiner form of education, bemoaning once again the sedentary lifestyle and this agriculture thing. I mean, super open question, I guess, but the importance of that connection to the earth, the connection to agriculture, and that connection of being outside, of doing in that sense.
Yeah. So a couple things happened there. One was a very puzzling moment where I believe it was Aaron Reed Pfeiffer, who became an agricultural guy as well, where they were in the car after some lecture and they were going somewhere to go to another lecture that Steiner was going to give. And he asked Steiner in the car, as I recall the anecdote, he said, "What's the greatest hindrance in the future for the spiritual development of humanity?" Good question, huh?
Mm-hmm.
And Steiner said, "Nutrition."
Wow.
So what was going to happen, and then this, it was something that, he didn't give these lectures on agriculture till almost the end of his life, was that we're going to see food that looks like food, but there will be no life in that food anymore. Sound familiar?
Yeah, it sounds very familiar.
Like they say in America, you got to pay extra for non-poisoned food. So that's already kind of so backwards and upside down. And so here we are talking about this animalization of humanity, this destruction of consciousness. And we could say from Steiner's, breathtakingly practical seeing of our world through his spiritual eyes, that he saw that as you deteriorate the food of people, right, you are what you eat, that they're going to try for spiritual abilities and try to do the exercises, and more these hindrances are going to come at them because they're not getting enough nutrition. So down there, and he was already in the 1913, 1912, they were already doing agricultural experiments at the Goetheanum in Switzerland and in Stuttgart and some of these other places. But eventually, and then in 1924, there was this Count Kaiserlink from the Silesia area who had asked Steiner a number of times if he would give a course of lectures on agriculture. Because especially if you can imagine in Europe, for 400 years, the deteriorations of their agricultural methods and just literally working that soil in a semi-conscious way was deteriorating it, right? Even if they were trying to do a good job, it was still really hard on soil that had been growing plants for hundreds of years compared to America, right? Kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So he would always go poo-poo them because he was so busy, he just didn't have time. And finally, there's a wonderful story. The Count sent his nephew and said, camp on his doorstep until he pulls out his notebook and writes down the dates for those lectures he's going to give us. Because once Steiner did that, then he was committed, then he would come. And sure enough, then he did, and gave this magnificent course, the biodynamic agricultural cycle, that is renowned, and some argue one of the most esoteric things Steiner ever gave. For 2 weeks he was there, and it was really quite something. It's wonderful to read many of the books actually that have been written about that time. And so out of that, what do you have? Well, again, I'm not an expert on these things, James, but I played around with it over the years, and a lot of it is old folk wisdom. A lot of it is old. He lived in farming communities. He worked with farmers around as a child. So he had a lot of their knowledge before that got lost, right? Mm-hmm. They had that old, but at the same time, spiritually, he could see what he could see as well, and talked about, so you've heard of some of these things. So for instance, he said compost piles are sort of like stomachs on the surface of the earth.
I haven't heard this.
Okay. And if you design that compost pile correctly and bring in homeopathic doses of things like silica and quartz and proper manures of animals, okay, and these kinds of things, and do all this in connection and in concert with the sun and the planets in the movements that they're doing, they will also ray down cosmic spiritual forces into that compost pile. And together you can dynamize that soil out of spiritual science to a quality that the earth itself can't even achieve.
Wow.
That's astonishing.
That's back to the idea of hierarchy, right? Drawing down higher forces.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so here, and again, as we were saying before, spiritual science will never do this. It doesn't see in homeopathic substances anything there, right? Right. So, but he's saying what the homeopathic substances are. Have you ever heard that before? It's beautiful from anthroposophy that it's a digression. Everything in the world that you and I see, let's say in the natural world, ultimately is a precipitation of something that was once a cosmic process. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that's almost common sense. So in homeopathy, when you take some of that physical dead detritus, the substance that's there, and you put it in these waters and you stir it vigorously in a certain manner, in such a way that the substance itself is just gone. And then you take a tenth of that and put that in another gallon of water and do it. And then a tenth of that and put that in a gallon of water. Steiner's saying that ultimately what you're doing, if you do it right, is you're going backwards. You're going back from the physical substance and using it sort of as a pointer. If you think about it from almost a computer science point of view, a pointer back to the cosmic process, which recognizes, you might say, you're doing that and dives right in, you might say, and energizes that substance with the cosmic process a little bit, so that if you intake it in a medicine or something, your etheric body, which is the process that creates your physical body, really wakes up, or your astral body really wake up to the presence of, shall we say, the more process-oriented substance in you. Does that make sense? I kind of said that funny.
Yeah. No,
that's the argument anyway. That's the argument. So anyway, so these plants then, this agricultural, that's one aspect of it. But then during the growth of the plant, so that would be your soil. You would always be working on your soil. And Steiner said plants can't get sick. It's impossible for a plant to become ill.
What happens when a plant sort of, well, to be honest, what happens is when a plant is getting sick then?
Exactly. Is that the environment, the soil is incorrect. You work on the environment the plant is in, and once that environment has been healed, the plant's just what it is anyway. I mean, it's an interesting argument, right?
Mm-hmm. You know, so he's very much a terrain, not a germ guy then.
It's possible we could say that. I don't know the difference between those, but definitely a holism, right? And deep ecology, right? That's just needs to happen there. So we have the soil, but then during the times of the plants, there's places where the plant gets to a certain place where Steiner says you can help it to read the cosmos. You can help it to sort of read the influences of the cosmos and take them in. I think that's kind of how he said it. And so one of the things he did was he talked about horns, the horns of animals, that these horns, if you look at the vortices of how the vortices have been used to create these horns, he says this very, very profound cosmic activity that has brought a horn into existence. And horns are the sense organ, a sense organ in cows and stuff like that. So they're never cut off until a certain time on the farm, because they're very, very important to the health of the cows. And so what they would take these horns in the end of the summer, and they would pack them with cow manure. Mm-hmm. And then they bury them in the ground for the whole winter.
Wow.
And they'll have a giant pile of these, hundreds of them, and they'll open that up at the end of the winter, and they'll pull this out, and they'll pour this stuff out, which is, I think it's called the 500 preparation, and it's magnificent humus. And Steiner says you've got these cosmic forces from the heavens that are able to work through the magnificence of the substances of these horns and the processes, you might say, that are incarnated in there to do something to this. And then you homeopathize that stuff in a certain way. It's more like a tea. And then you take that tea and then you spread that on the plants at a certain time. You spread a homeopathic silica at a certain time. You put a quartz at a certain time. And all these things help the plants stay connected to the cosmos. Now that's organic, man.
Wow.
They talk organic agriculture. I just laugh out loud. So what happens? Well, what did you get from this? So all the, you have the number one. You've heard of it maybe in England, but you just go across the pond there, to Central Europe, and you've got the Demeter agricultural label. You've heard of that? Demeter?
No, I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just go over there. It's the premium produce of all of Europe, and it's biodynamic produce. It's all biodynamic. Okay, and then you have the pharmaceutical companies that, like Valeda and Dr. Hauschka and Uriel and all these and Vala, which are all these massive pharmaceutical companies, all helped into existence by Steiner, that use biodynamic plants that are then, Steiner gave the indications of how to preserve the etheric forces of these plants in medicines and all these kinds of things. And again, all coming back to what? The question in the car. What is the greatest hindrance to the spiritual development of our future? And Steiner says nutrition. Wow. So even there, he didn't just say it, he dived right in, right? Isn't that something? It's just something to me that it puts him on a plane. I'm sorry, nobody touches him in terms of spiritual teachers, because he didn't just talk about the ideas. He had such a clarity in the highest spiritual realms that he could take that and just bring it down into the physical world like nobody's business, man. And these people listen. Think about it. All these haughty Central European people, with all their PhDs, they listen to this guy. He spoke with authority, man. He spoke with authority. It's amazing when you think about it.
So this was because the spiritual nutrition and spiritual recipes and this idea of food in spirituality is a real deep interest of mine, and I'd love to create a spiritual cookbook with all these different recipes. I'm trying to compile them, but they are, as you probably imagine, extremely difficult to find. I've probably only got 5 or 6 at the moment that have their sort of a history to them. But this idea, I mean, is extremely key, because I mean, one thing I often tell people, about the supplementation via supplements in the West. Now people say, well, you can get all that from your diet, and I say, well, actually, if you look at the erosion and the destruction of soils, you realize that the nutrients is no longer in them at all, so you can't get it from your diet often, unless of course it's probably been truly, as you say, truly organically farmed. But I mean, is this a case, you're speaking of sort of farmer's old wisdom of, quite literally, you are what you eat, in the sense of your being, your spiritual being is what you eat?
I wouldn't want to black and white it quite that much, but I think you're really right. I think you're right, especially for us fledgling, waddling around here trying to take our first steps in spiritual development. We need all the help we can get. So yes, the foodstuffs, and you could say nutrients. You could think of the physical nutrients, but also, James, take into account that it allows the etheric forces to remain healthy in the plants. And what you really ingest is etheric forces. That's what ultimately you completely destroy the substances in your own organism, and these etheric forces then draw from the environment around you what your body needs. It's really quite something. There's only one part of our body that really uses physical substances, and that's the brain. The rest of our body actually uses almost the substances as pointers to what it then draws through breath and through light and all these things from the environment. Very bizarre. I know that's very bizarre, but he gets into that. Back to your point, though. So that those life forces are something that, how do we preserve those? Dr. Hauschka was very famous with that, based on the questions he asked Steiner about it. He said, what is life? And Steiner said, rhythm. And so he would use these they do this thing in a Hauschka thing. They'll shake in a lemniscate form these substances in these bottles, and they'll do it for an hour or 2 hours. And it allows them to it creates a stability that lasts for a really long time. Really amazing stuff like that. You've heard of Dr. Hauschka products, right?
I've heard the name. Yeah, I did. I didn't.
Yeah,
I didn't understand he had the
yeah,
connection though.
yeah, absolutely did. Yeah, very much so. He's got a book called The Nature of Substance, which is all about his experiences with Steiner and all the things that he did. And it's really quite a beautiful, profound book, really. So, you know, and again, all these things this guy did, and nobody knows who Rudolf Steiner is. Isn't that blow your mind? And he's an embarrassment. He can't be real. And this is science talking now. This is science talking. Well, of course he's not real. This is all hooliganism. This is all charlatanism, because we know what's true. And that can't be it. Right? It's a fascinating dogma. We just don't realize how. Here, you'll like this one. Let's try this out for a second. So in every in the evolution of consciousness throughout the cultures of the world, in every culture, they have had a direct knowing. And that direct knowing, you could say, is their science. Now, let's say at one time that direct knowing was the life of the elemental beings around them. And they did their farming and their understanding of that. Now, the other thing we didn't mention before I should throw in there is that in these clairvoyant orientations of consciousness, the sense of self was far weaker than it is in us. Okay, what the loss of them has done is isolated the individuality in us in our time. So we're very strong, central, egocentric creatures. And they were very much parts of tribes, right? And parts of groups of people that they felt far more their identity through others than through themselves. Okay, that's an important distinction, that there really was a positivity. Anytime something's gained, something is lost, right? Always, right? No matter what. So, okay, so they have a science, and it has to do with angels and archangels and elemental beings working. So then what happens? Well, their consciousness continues to evolve. And as it does, it moves out of that realm. And as it's moving out in the transition phase, as Steiner talks about this, the loss of it, of course, is becoming noticeable. So they codify it into myths, sagas, stories, right? Traditions. Isn't that fascinating? So when we look back at all of those things in like the sagas and myths of the Norse gods and all these different gods, we're seeing sort of the tail end of a modality of consciousness that was absolutely direct and existential in all these people. I find that fascinating. I just wanted to throw that out. So here we are in ours. Ours right now is the science of this dead physical world that we absolutely think is the way it's always been. Everybody saw the world that way from the very beginning, right? That's the fallacy, you might say, we're struggling with now. And someday, you know, it'll be interesting, you know, how that's already been codified, you might say, in the science. And science is fighting for its survival, maybe. And with spiritual science coming along and all these orientations and awarenesses of consciousness being something altogether other than what they say it is, that it's a spiritual activity in us, and it can grow and be changed by us now through our own efforts, that it's interesting what it'll all look like in 1,000 years, right?
I mean, it's interesting you bring in this idea of tribes and the collective, and obviously Steiner. Then his big thing is the the individual's place, the individual consciousness. But it's interesting you mentioned this idea with the tribes and the collectives, and the idea of their myths and their fables and their stories being codified, and these texts that we are then given, mythical texts, are primarily allegorical. They're like a rich meal to be dug into, full of nutrients that you really have to understand, and you spend a lot of time with them. And it's interesting that in the same way that the form of nutrients on the planet has mirrored this sort of dissension, where we now have no actual nutrients in the soil, and all these the foods, as Steiner said, the foods we look upon are they look like foods, but they're not really. In the same way, a lot of the stories that we're being told, they don't have that same depth. They look like stories, but really they're just these surface level creations. And it seems, maybe that's something we need to. I've thought this often, that it's quite ironic that really Steiner, Blavatsky, Gurdjieff, they seem to be the last myths of culture. It's very mythical to look back on these people's lives, because you think, well, how did they manage to do all this? And they're quite mythical figures. But since then, it's been quite a death of the allegorical, the fables. The idea of the parable, the idea of a deeper reading to a story.
I guess so. I mean, there's still some battles there. I mean, I don't know if it right because we sat, and I hate to bring it up, but we have all these movies and all these storytelling that goes on in movies, right? That draws people into them. Now, it's a pretty sad comparison, I know, but I remember. I'll tell you one of the very few things that really sat me in my chair, so I had to wait for the show to come on a second time. And I used to do that as a kid, right? You'd stay in the theater and kind of hide and not have to pay twice and see the movie again. No, I didn't do that this time, but was the Matrix. The Matrix blew my mind. I went, now that was the first time kind of a myth had been told again, sadly, in such a materialistic way, of course, that just was so revelatory in its own way, right? I'm digressing too far with that, but I found that just gripping. I mean, wow, they're telling a story there that does jar us, out of maybe our complacencies a little bit. Though I think people took it in a nutty way anyway, but that's that. But okay, sorry about that digression. That wasn't worth anything.
No.
But yes, I agree with you. I agree that the stories don't seem to have the same kind of thing. And at the same time, imagination, right? Imagination isn't, in Waldorf education, one of the things they're trying to do is preserve the imagination. Right. So that's why things are couched in story form, so that the consciousness that the child's in at that time, which is natural to it at that time, it is living in pictures and living in kind of the morally saturated pictorial consciousness. And yet you want to teach the child. So you couch everything in these stories. And as they learn the stories, they also learn the, let's say, scientific facts at the same time. Interesting, right? It's almost like the sagas of the past being used consciously now. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. There's a guy named Owen Barfield. Did you ever read Owen Barfield? Great Brit. He's a great Brit.
I have heard the name, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So he wrote a book called Saving the Appearances, and also a wonderful book called Romanticism Comes of Age. And this idea of, okay, that's maybe too far afield. And he's a Brit, and he was one of the Inklings with Tolkien and Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis, and all these guys they'd meet together and created the modern fantasy genre. Right? George MacDonald was already dead, but he was probably the grandfather of it all at the time, right? But are any of these names familiar to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Big fan of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien. I've yet to get around to MacDonald, but yeah.
So go ahead. Barfield is in there, and he was a very close friend of Lewis, and he was a profound anthroposophist. Very, very intense. All of his work, frankly, is anthroposophical, even though people think he's an original thinker. He's just a really, really good writer of Steiner's ideas, in my opinion, but I'll get in trouble for that. But he's very highly regarded, Barfield is. And they had the arguments, he and C.S. Lewis, with his Ulster Protestantism and stuff, right? So there's even letters. I have some letters between them. I don't know. I haven't read much of them. But why did I bring him up? Sorry, rambled there.
Fairy tales and
yes, allegory. And so all that. So we do have that side to this, that we've sort of accidentally hit on a little bit of imagination, right? That kind of is trying to tell story still, trying to teach through myth and saga and story still in our time, right? I mean, Lord of the Rings, for heaven's sake, that's a powerful allegory for the human, for spiritual development, you could say, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know if we've agreed with ourselves or contradicted ourselves.
No, I think it was just a nice digression on allegory. Definitely. No. So, okay, one question, just jumping back to the nutrition, because it's a very practical thing. I mean, when I got the book on nutrition, I was a bit worried because I have a diet which is very high in meat. And I realized Steiner said, well, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do this. It's not very spiritual. So I guess, as Steiner is this very, very practical figure, I mean, what's the practical application of his understanding of nutrition and agriculture in this sense? What should we be aiming towards as spiritual beings?
So, first of all, Steiner really never did say don't eat meat to people in general. But he said this. He said, and this was more in the esoteric lessons, right, that he gave to people that said, we want to aspire, we want to be your pupils, and we want to aspire to spiritual development. He goes, okay, if you're going to aspire to spiritual development, then it is illogical to consume meat.
Mm-hmm.
And now this is an interesting argument. So he's saying that an animal raises these substances up. Okay, the plant has these substances at a certain level of being. The animal takes those and raises them up to another level of being, so that when the human being consumes the animal flesh, they are then they only need to take that animal flesh up one level into the human level, you might say, right? And so it's easier to do. And in that sense, you're not using all the forces of your organism properly. If you take the plant substance, you have to then raise it, let's say 2 stages. And in that, the soul life is strengthened. And the abilities for concentration and all these things for spiritual development are maximized. But in a way, he says in a few places, almost dismissively, if you're not into spiritual development, it just doesn't matter. You're having one of those lifetimes, where you're just going along with the herd, and you're still developing what you're developing, and with karma and everything ruling in your life, right? And it's still an unfolding, and it's still a growth. But you decided in this lifetime not to take on your own development consciously. Mm-hmm. And if you did, you wouldn't eat meat anymore. So it's interesting, right? He's never like that. He never tells people to do this or not to do that. It has to do with the logic of their intentions.
I see.
What do you think? Yeah.
Well, no, I think that's a common, thread between a lot of spiritual teachers, right? Gurdjieff and even Crowley, people will say their relationship with you was dependent on, if you said, I'm just looking into it, I'm just a sort of civilian, they just treat you like a normal person. But often, as soon as you said, no, I'd like to become one of your pupils, well, you've opened the floodgates, right, for a lot of flack, a lot of pressure, a lot of everything.
Yep. There you go. In a sense, yeah. It's different with Gurdjieff, I think, than Steiner. But yeah, I mean, who knows how it would have been standing in front of him when he was talking to you. So yeah. So,
he doesn't come across as a domineering spiritual teacher in that way.
Yeah, he really doesn't. Yeah, I mean, there were times that you listened to his when he would be in the Waldorf teacher the teachers would meet. There was a college of teachers generally that run a Waldorf school, and not an administration. The teachers do it together. And Steiner would be in there in the growth of the initial schools, and he could be very direct. Let me tell you, you know what I mean? Very, very direct about things. So there's that side of him. Definitely, he had to be, right. I mean, in Central Europe with all these power, imagine so many PhDs in their fields, in medicine and everything, were drawn to Steiner. So it's all about a very, very strong consciousness and clarity that is going to be pretty direct at times. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So one other aspect of his work that I wanted to bring in, because we didn't touch it last time. I mean, we touched a little bit on the Goetheanum and the architecture there, but I also wanted to bring in, some people actually know it's peculiar how people come across Steiner and these figures, especially when they're very diverse. Some people say, oh yeah, I really like his artwork, or I really like his drawings. It's peculiar that some people come via that angle. So I mean, I just wanted to open up with that as a question as well. What role did art play for Steiner?
Yeah, it's pretty central to, like, education, right? Education stayed in the realm of art. Well, what's happening? This is kind of fun. You think about what happens. Let's say I got a piece of clay in front of me, okay, and I stare at that clay, and I have an imagination in my mind of what I want that clay to become. Okay, and so my hand, I raise my hand, my thumb, I have my thumb, and I press my thumb into the clay, and I pull my thumb back, and I look at what I did. And I look again at the imagination of what I want to bring into being. And I return back again to the object, and I do the next action. And then you see how exquisite that is as a form of meditation. Yeah. Okay, for example, right? So if you could do that in an educational setting, where almost as much as possible, you're allowing the freedom in that child or whatever to have that kind of experience, it's spiritual in the highest sense, right? So there's that side to it. So art was everywhere, kind of all the time with him. In speech, so he did this thing where he taught what's called Sprachgestaltung, which is a form of artistic speech. And you do probably a 3 or 4 year study to do that right.
Mhm.
And then how about his visible movement, invisible speech called eurythmy?
Mhm.
Have
Mhm.
you heard of that?
No, I haven't. No.
Okay, so you might want to look that up. And there's a lot of videos, on YouTube on eurythmy, EURYTHMY, and Steiner there is talking about how a clairvoyant sees the creation of speech and what it looks like to a clairvoyant, and how we can take that picture and bring it into human movement and manifest speech visibly for people to see. It's really, really something to see. And that's a very rigorous 4-year training to become a eurythmist. Very
Wow.
serious thing. But it's also in music too. So our body has fourths and fifths and seconds in the organism, in your hands and in your arms and all this stuff, all this microcosmic manifestation of the music of the spheres, you might say, lives in the human being. And that's also, so there's visible music too. So to see a Beethoven symphony being done with 50 eurythmists on the stage, and they're wearing these different silk flowing things for the majors and the minors and the timbres of the instruments, and they're moving back and forth and through each other and not running into each other, and the whole thing is a visible picture of a Beethoven symphony.
Wow.
Okay, so this is another thing Steiner did, which is a lot of people really find themselves into anthroposophy once they see eurythmists. It's just astonishing, really, to see. And you can, in a Waldorf school, every Waldorf school, if it's a Waldorf school and hasn't become something else over time, which they can do, has a eurythmy teacher, and they have a eurythmy class every day. And they do eurythmy, and it's incredibly taxing, demanding thing. You wouldn't believe it, okay? But it's also stunning. So when I would go as an adult to eurythmy classes on Saturdays or whatever you could take, I was so tantalized because they would be doing something and saying something, and you're going, yeah, that is what you're saying, the word you're saying or the vowel you're saying or whatever. Yeah, what you just did, yeah, that is that. But I don't have it all in my head. I don't. You're just tantalized because you're seeing like half of something, and you know it's right, but you don't see the other half. And it's just absolutely something to see. I mean, there you see kind of a spirituality coming out of Steiner in that art form. That's a staggering. Yeah, it's just staggering to me. Sorry, I'm getting sycophantic here in a little bit, but so here's a fun one. Okay, so Steiner's talking about the arts. Let's see if we've got enough of this. So he says when you look at architecture, architecture really comes out of the human being just experiencing the physical forces in their organism, and that experience really brought forth, you might say, the manifestation of architecture as an art. If you look at sculpture, in sculpture, you're seeing the etheric body, which is our sculptor of our physical body, right? If a clairvoyant, I'm going to say it kind of this way, though I don't remember exactly if Steiner would say it this way. If you were to see somebody doing sculpture, he says you would see the person, clairvoyantly, you would see their etheric body pressing into their physical body as they're doing sculpture. Okay. Then he says, so now if you see somebody painting, and they're all with color and all this stuff, you see that a clairvoyant would see that person's astral body pressing into their etheric body. And now you see somebody making music and doing music and writing music. He said you would see the person's ego being pressing into their astral body. And then if you saw somebody writing poetry, and true poetry, I don't know how much of that is actually around anymore, but okay, but true poetry, you would see their next higher member, which is not quite here yet, called the spirit self, which is this transformed astrality that we're working on right now as human beings. The spirit self, this echo of the spirit self in the human being, pressing into their ego. And we'd have to talk about, maybe give some characterizations of what spirit self means. But, and then finally, let's say finally, for now, when you see eurythmy, you would see the higher member of this transformed etheric body called the spirit self, the life spirit, pressing into the spirit self. Those are very abstract up there. But so even this art form is kind of something that came from, seeing these things. And then there's a higher one than that. He calls the coming social art, whatever that is. That is the higher, the spirit human being pressing into the life spirit. Sorry, that I know that might be abstract for people, but if they look Steiner up, it's a very, very cool thing that when you hear those, James, they just make sense. They're just shockingly elegant ways of seeing the human beings, members, and their interaction with each other in the manifestation of all these arts.
So, I mean, it seems to be. I guess I'm slowly realizing over this conversation that I'm a bit more of a pessimist. I guess in terms of what's happened to these things. I mean, once again, art in this sense, ironically, has become almost like other things, just about the surface. And I think,
absolutely,
yeah, I wonder what's removed when you don't have that deeper understanding of, as you say, different bodies pressing into each other as something. Developing underneath, what does art become? As you said, the idea of true poetry, we can somehow discern between true and insincere poetry, and maybe that's what happens is you end up with something where you intuitively know, yeah, that's technically art, but it doesn't quite make the leap.
Yeah, I think that's just our materialistic age. I think that materialism is inartistic at its bottom. Yeah, it just is. I mean, we are in the great darkness. We just are. I mean, otherwise we just wouldn't feel so strongly about people like Steiner when they come, that there's just the other half of the world is being presented to us. Can we truly integrate it, not just believe in it as a belief system? Who needs that? I need existential experience of this I need to be healed by a knowing, right? That's deeper than the knowing I'm taught to know in schools and stuff, right? Cramming with a text in front of me. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Even though that's all we've got right now, right? Dale talking.
You called it the great darkness. Is that a Steiner name?
It is not. No, it's not. That's. I mean, in some ways that the fall is turning. And he really is optimistic about that at bottom, at the same time that he's not looking through rose-colored glasses. You know what I mean? And that's the difference in Steiner with a lot of people, is that, there's heavy stories in there, right? I mean, they're pretty heavy. The picture of Ahriman, if Ahriman really just takes over and we dismiss the Christ and even Lucifer and just let Ahriman run rampant, I mean, we're pretty much in that modality right now. What are we going to do with that? It's, he wants to just turn the whole thing into a closed off system of the earth that has nothing to do with the rest of the cosmos anymore at all. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, one question I have, just coming from as you know, I'm fond of Gurdjieff.
Yeah.
And he's very deterministic about things. For Steiner, this is quite a rough way of putting it, but for Steiner, can anyone make it? Could anyone do this stuff that he's talking about, or is it in any way select?
So that's a paradox for me, because I like universalism, and I think he does say that, as opposed to many other things in the world where talent and all these other things are part of it, he says anyone can begin the journeys in spiritual development, right? That's unless there's massive brain damage or something, obviously. But so there's that. But then he also does paint a picture of some part of humanity that is going to fall away. It's going to fall away with sort of an earth that is sort of a leftover crust thing that can't be incorporated back into the spiritual world. So right between every planetary incarnation we've had, starting with old Saturn, after old Saturn went through its evolution, it disappeared into kind of a spiritual world that Steiner couldn't see. He calls it the pralaya, right? And that's an old Hindu term, right? Where it goes completely into pure spirituality, and then it reconstitutes itself in a form that recapitulates old Saturn, and then moves further in its evolution. That was called old Sun. And that who knows how many millions or billions or trillions of years, because it's a different kind of time thing. Then that reached its evolutionary end and then dissipated in a way that became purely spiritual. Steiner couldn't perceive it anymore, so he calls it the pralaya. And then it reemerges into existence again as old moon and recapitulates both old Saturn and old sun before it then continues its evolution. Then it goes through a process of completion, and there is this pralaya. And after that, then the Earth evolution proper that we're in right now begins. And at the beginning of that, it recapitulates old Saturn, old sun, old moon. And kind of only with a certain period called the Lemurian period did Earth evolution itself begin. And that's when the Elohim, or the exousiae, in the middle of the Lemurian period, at the time the moon was being extricated from the Earth, brought individualized egos into the physical plane, and reincarnation began.
Whoa.
And only since then have we been reincarnating and you know, what's the right word? And growing our egos, becoming beings of self. You know, and what is the goal of that? The goal of that is selflessness, but not a selflessness where you've given up what you have, but a selflessness that is willed out of a true self, like the Christ. The Christ is the perfect self. He's the most complete, total self that's ever existed. And what was his greatest act? Selflessness. So that's cool to me. That's very different from kind of the Eastern, my understanding of Eastern orientations, right? Even though after Mahayanic Buddhism, I think it becomes very similar to Christianity, which, by the way, came into existence 100 years after the event of Christ.
So why was the option for an ego put in this Lemurian time period in the first place? You know, why was that option founded within the universe?
Well, it was okay. So I mean, okay. So first of all, we needed a physical body for it to occur in, and that was prepared in its first incarnation on old Saturn. And we needed an etheric body. Its first incarnation was on old Sun. And we needed an astral body, and its first incarnation was in old Moon. So by the time you got to Lemuria, these bodies had been brought to enough of a completion that an ego could find a relationship, the beginning, right, of a relationship to them. It was still really outside them, but it was connected to them. So right. So what's happening? So you're asking a bigger question than that, right? You're saying, well, what is the reason for this thing called ego beings to even exist at all in the cosmos? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Right. And that is, again, you could say this, right? Humanity, Steiner says this. Humanity is the religion of the gods.
Wow.
So they are out there, you might say, on the periphery, pouring their forces, their qualities into us in a way where we stay free, unless they're backward beings like Luciferic and harmonic beings who are trying to get in there and take, and grab hold of us through temptation and all that stuff, right? And what's happening is that another hierarchy of beings is being brought into the relationship of the cosmos, the real cosmos, not the dead one our eyes see, but the one filled with life and filled with consciousness, all the way up to the farthest stars. Every star is a colony of spiritual beings, Steiner says, right? For instance, right? We only see this dead physical part of them that's shining at us. And we know what they are, right? But so okay, that's, and we're getting into kind of a maybe woo-woo land for people, right? Okay, but we have this happened. So in Old Moon, the angels went through their human stage. They were human, whatever that word exactly means, right? Where an ego nature found its relationship to them, even though they're one with the cosmos in a way that's way beyond us. And before them, the archangels on old Sun went through a human stage. And on old Saturn, the very first one, when time came into existence, was during that period, is when the archai beings went through their human stage. So meanwhile, they all became hierarchies of beings that are now mothering us into existence. Is my kind of way of saying this, which isn't not Steiner, but I'm an awkward guy, so I'm doing my best on that. And then and this evolutionary chain of being, right, that goes all the way up to the seraphim and the cherubim and the thrones, and then above and beyond them, the Trinity, that is, is this wondrous story that Steiner shares in so many of his lecture cycles. It's just, you've got to be kidding me. And yet it's not Xena and these D9 planes landing people in volcanoes like on Scientology. I mean, that's just some sad pictures, man. This is very gorgeous, and it's very spiritual. It's not rarefied, like the real danger is spiritual materialism, right? Where we just take the materialistic pictures we have and just make them thinner and transplant them into something we then call spiritual. That's not healthy. So I'm rambling a little, sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. So these other beings that you mentioned, that they were mothering us into existence. Do we have a duty to mother anything else into existence for Steiner?
Well, it will. That he does say that, what happens with these beings is they end up getting to a point in their development where they can give birth to a cosmos. So our cosmos was given birth to in old Saturn by a hierarchy of beings, in the highest hierarchy called the thrones. And the thrones, these are Dionysius the Areopagites, Christian terminology that he uses for the hierarchies. But you could talk about the Amshaspans and all these other beings and all, and Zarathustrianism and stuff that are there too. And they're part of this whole picture. They're the same thing, just from a different point of view. But he talks about in Occult Science, that book, An Outline of Occult Science or An Outline of Esoteric Science, he talks about how the beginnings of all this happened, how they began the creation of a universe. And eventually other beings will do that. And eventually, in a far, 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 far future, that would be something that we would ultimately do as a hierarchy of beings in our development, is we would birth a cosmos.
Wow.
And again, well, is it over then, Dale? See what I mean? We all want to have in our linear sequential modality of consciousness a beginning and an end to things. And it just sounds, Dale, you're just kind of fobbing off the answer with another cycle of evolution all the time. And you know what? It sounds like that in how we understand the world. It doesn't have an ending or a beginning like you and I want it to have, you might say. Even like when we look at plants, you know what I mean? I mean, it's so interesting. That seed is the deadest part, and yet once it unites with the environment, right? Heavens, look what we get, it's just amazing. Yeah.
So I mean, in the great grand scheme of things, then, this birth and death of cosmoses and this continual evolution, it's almost hard to find the place of the individual small human. What is to be done for the individual person who wants to push themselves to grow, to evolve in relation to that, that massive cosmological thing that's going on?
Yeah, say more.
Well, I just, as you said, you were saying that people might joke about, they say, oh, you're fobbing it off with another, and then there's this next cycle, then there's this next cycle. And I think for the individual, for the individual ego who's seeking to, quote unquote, become enlightened or evolve their spirituality, to grow in some sense, it's easy to get lost in those bigger pictures of things. And, it's almost like, what's the first step? What's the first thing to realize to get yourself sort of imbued with that sight that could see the world in this way?
Yeah, and for me, that would be whatever tradition or path you find, that you begin with study. Is that too small an answer? I mean, you just have to begin by finding an orientation. We have the orientation that science and our culture has given us, and the sense of self is pretty small, right? In that, right? Mm-hmm. So the cosmos. Okay, so good. This is good. Let's throw this out. So what did we talk about? What happens when a person falls asleep?
I don't think so.
So here you got your physical body and your etheric body and your astral body and your ego. Okay. So the problem is that consciousness, to manifest on the physical plane, the astral body and the ego, those are, let's say, our consciousness bodies. For consciousness to manifest on the physical plane, it has to destroy. It has to destroy life. So consciousness enters into our etheric body, and it actually creates like a void in an area there in which we wake up. And during the time we're awake, our physical body and our etheric body are really undergoing a lot of damage because we're awake in them. Is that a new one for you?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah. Okay. So when you fall asleep, literally a clairvoyant watches you fall asleep, your astral body and your ego separate. That is called sleep, by the way. I have no other understanding of sleep than that after 40 years of thinking about this, right? And what then happens is all of a sudden your etheric body, Steiner says, you could almost see plant-like forms just flower in it. As when it's free of the presence of consciousness, it goes in and rebuilds as much of the damage that was done while consciousness was there that it can.
Okay. So you need sleep.
In this profound sense. But then on the other side of that, the ego and the astral body, then they expand out, let's say, as far as the moon. So you're as large as, with the earth at the center, by the way, which is still a valid paradigm in anthroposophy, not the sun at the center, but the earth at the center, and the planets creating around us, creating spheres around the earth. Okay. That's not wrong. It's just that it got lost from science saying that's stupid. We can do better math with the sun at the center. But there's the spirit, the humanism of Steiner. We haven't talked about his humanism yet, but that's Steiner's humanism. Okay, so I'm digressing. So, and what happens is that we take all the deeds of the waking state we just lived through. We just woke up and we lived that day awake, and then we fell asleep again. Well, what we did during that time, in every thinking action and in every feeling action, James, and in every act of will, we created moral substance. In the smallest existential moment you can imagine. Every moment we're doing this, okay? And we take that, the astral work, and that's our astral substance. We take that astral substance, and Steiner I think he used a phrase in one of the early books where we're actually weaving this tapestry of moral quintessence that we take from that's kind of why the ego and the astral body dive down into there and live on the live in the world kind of thing. Is right, is for this moral agency to grow through its mistakes and everything else, and experience its karma from past lives and everything. And also, given the nature of your consciousness, you also absorb renewed moral forces from the cosmos. They feed you every day. But Steiner says if humanity cannot find a relationship to the higher beings, especially Christ, over time we'll sort of encrust our soul so that these higher beings that want to infuse us with vivifying spiritual forces for our next day awake in consciousness, that's in danger. Okay, and we'll lose our sense of morality slowly, little bit by little bit. Our sense of right will get injured because of I would say this, just because of the gruesome materialism of our modern science. But it could be other reasons too, just dark magic that you get into, whatever. So here we have this thing going. Okay, so now when you die, well, what happens then? Well, it's kind of obvious. I mean, again, these things become common sense. When you die, your etheric body, which is tenaciously attached to your physical body, separates from it. And now those 330 billion cells a day that your body is casting off, it continues to do. But there's no etheric body there to replace them anymore. Right. So your body just does what it's been doing every day since the day you were born. It's just that your life body is. But what happens is, because the etheric body is not tied to the physical body anymore, it turns, you might say, and pours all its forces into your consciousness. And when those forces pour into your consciousness, they appear there as your life flashing before your eyes. And you get this panorama. It takes about 3 days to process and experience it as you begin your excarnation process out of your physical life you just had, right? And your life passes before your eyes for about 3 days. So we have wakes, right? The old wakes from the religion, where it was a deep wisdom that they still knew there's a time to let the body be at rest. There's a time for the body to be held in quiet and to be cocooned by our concerns, so that the excarnating person can have this panorama, can brood inside this panorama of the existence it just had, from the moment it died till the moment it was born. And I mean, vivifying detail. Steiner says it's hundreds of times more intense than any of the actual experiences you had while you were alive, because your physical body sort of buffers the intensity of it. But now it's just intense. So then by then your ego has expanded out, and you are as large as the moon sphere around the earth. You were saying how big or how small we are. I'm giving you a picture of how big we are now. I'm actually on the subject, okay? Mm-hmm. So then during this time, you now go to that tapestry I mentioned that your astral body had been building during the whole time you were alive. Well, you're 60 and you die. James, how long did you lay in the bed and sleep if you're 60 when you die?
For a third of it, 20 years.
Yeah, just say that out loud again.
20 years.
Right?
Yeah.
20 years. Okay. Oh, what a waste of time. Let's make some amphetamine drugs and keep these suckers awake all the time, man. That's science, right? We're wasting a whole third of my life. No, right? So what happens now, Steiner says, is you enter into this what he calls kamaloka, using the ancient Hindu word, I believe it is. And from the moment you died, you now go back to that life. And again, it takes about a third of the time that you lived your life, obviously, because that's the 20 years of your life you were creating this tapestry. And instead of experiencing your deed, your thinking moment, your feeling moment, your willing moment, you experience its effect on the other person, and you experience it totally intensely. Okay. And again, this is part of this excarnation process, to go from a myopic, ego-centered being to a being that's part of the hierarchies of the world, spiritual beings that are going to help us now on our journey. We have to kind of extricate ourselves from our own myopic orientation, right? Which we needed while we were on the earth, or we wouldn't have survived. So you go through that life, and after that, then you expand out to what he calls the Mercury sphere, which is the planet Venus, and there's a reason for that. And then you're now involved with the hierarchy of beings that are related to Mercury. And they help now. Steiner gives these magnificent lectures on this called Between Death and Rebirth, okay, that you just have to read. There's no way I can do justice to them. And then you go out all the way to Venus, which is the closest to the sun, we call Mercury. And then finally you abide for 3 times as long in the sun sphere itself. Then you go to the Mars sphere. Then you go to the Jupiter sphere and the Saturn sphere. And then when you get to there, he says, you come to a place, and you're that big. Okay. You as a being are that large. And it depends on your spiritual development that you acquired on the earth, how awake you are by now, in a certain sense, right? This is all about spiritual development. The very developed are awake then. Let's say Steiner would probably be awake all the way out to the Saturn sphere. You get to a kind of the cosmic midnight hour of existence, he calls it. And his mystery plays, I don't know if you know that Steiner wrote 4 mystery dramas that are done at the Goetheanum. It take about 25 hours to do the 4 plays.
Wow.
By the way,
surprise me.
He did that when when he wasn't doing anything else, by the way. Right? Yeah. So anyway, there's this moment that comes where you kind of are allowed a decision. Now, I think he says that sort of to try to communicate it, but I don't know how real that decision is. It depends how awake you are, where you can stay in the spiritual world if you want to. But if you do, you'll forever be a cripple there. And instead, the picture of the Christ sort of rises in front of you, and the Christ is this picture of the complete human being. Okay? And I guess, no, and it has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with this, what the Christ being was after its incarnation in the physical, etheric, and astral bodies of Jesus of Nazareth, and took those up and then completely evolved them to the end of time. So that the Christ being stands as the first totally, completely evolved human being at the end of everything we've been talking about, okay? That ready to birth a cosmos kind of being, right? Okay, maybe not that far yet, who knows. Okay, so then what normally happens is that this outward expanding orientation becomes a contracting, compressing orientation, and a desire to take the karma and take the fruits of other lifetimes and live another lifetime on the earth. And then you've been going back through the spheres until you finally get to the earth. So that's how big you are.
Whoa.
Now that's different, isn't it? I don't think that's nutsy. You know, I mean, you and I can have pictures of that in our mind's eye. And you know what? See, and think of it. What is the exact opposite picture we're given from science? That you're a meaningless speck on a meaningless speck of Earth in an empty space all around you. That's the other side of the story. And that's not false. You see, it's so fascinating because we do have to separate ourselves from the higher beings for this gall darn evolution to continue, you know? And I just really would rather have them around.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's maybe what's at the bottom of us all kind of feeling our way back to spiritual world, you know, spiritual development and being dissatisfied. But it's all, yeah, there's crises and everything else. Anyway, I just was very great. And this is, again, an outline of esoteric science, and then filled in by many, many cycles that he gave about life between death and rebirth.
Wow.
Very concrete, very concrete.
There's nothing I can really add to follow that up, because it was, that is, as you say, something that people are probably going to go have to read, because it's extremely intense and deep.
And I did a very poor job. I did a very poor job. No doubt about it. Okay. Because I read that stuff over and over again. I have them in my car. I listen to them. I'm like, wow. I mean, who was this guy? You know, it's fascinating.
Okay, that's maybe a question to wrap up in a way, because I'm always interested in this sort of question with these people. I mean, so for instance, yeah, I'll bring in my old favorite Gurdjieff again. There is people who sort of said, look, when you read certain biographical accounts of him, people say, to be honest, it was like being with someone who wasn't really human, not in an inhuman way, but someone, you know, you could never say this person was human, and which really leads to that understanding of why none of his followers ever really got to his level, because you think, actually, maybe it's because he was something else. And I feel the same way about Steiner, because, you know, you look at Steiner's work and his output, and you think, you know, and this question I brought in last time of, well, when did he have the time, one, to write it all, two, to read enough to know all that, and three, then to synthesize it on top of everything else that he's doing. And I think the only conclusion you can come to is that there's another element at play. So an open-ended question, but who do you think Steiner was?
So let's go to, first of all, a couple of things you mentioned. One is reading, right? So there's reading books, and then there's reading the Akashic Chronicle, right? You've heard of that?
No.
Oh, we didn't touch on that then. Okay.
No,
so as part of your spiritual development and my spiritual development, there comes a time when we transcend our own private life of memory, and we begin to access a memory life that another living being has. And that other living being is the earth. The earth has a living memory, like having an etheric body with all those living memories I told you about. And when initiates get as high as Steiner, they're able to access that living memory of the earth. Now, the earth is intimately connected to humanity, and we haven't really talked about that, but it's for us. It was us. The whole earth is like something we cast off until we could find a form that the ego could live in. And that happened in the Lemurian time we talked about earlier. During all that time, humanity was, nope, we can't incarnate yet because we've got the animal realm. Okay, move them out. No, we can't incarnate the ego because we've still got the plant realm. Okay, move that out. Isn't that wild? And then eventually these things became external to us, and the form and function of whatever was there didn't look like us now, but it was enough for the ego to begin its incarnational activity, okay, that given by these higher beings. So why did I bring that up? Okay, so we're talking about who Steiner was and who these guys are, right, in general. So we have this being who was, you could say, was the greatest initiate in the world up to that time, and that was Zarathustra, which is probably the oldest religion. Zarathustrianism is probably the oldest of all religions, 7,000 BC or whatever is when it started, way before all these other ones, right? Mm-hmm. And this being, Zarathustra, then, he was so advanced that when he died, his etheric body didn't disintegrate into the cosmic ether as yours will and as mine will, let's say. It was preserved in the earth sphere. And his astral body as well was preserved in the earth sphere. And these then were used by people later in history. So his etheric body became the etheric body of Moses. And it had all these incredible knowledge and the stories of Genesis living in it. Okay. And these poured out of his etheric body through Moses's stories, right? We get Genesis. And the Hermes Thoth, the founder of Egypt, had the astral body of Zarathustra. Okay, so these things are going on here, just to kind of give you these pictures. So there's a set of lectures given in 1909, I believe, by Steiner called the Principles of Spiritual Economy. And it talks about in many initiates that they're so advanced that their bodies don't disintegrate. Their physical does, obviously, but their other ones don't. And they're actually ended up influencing the evolution of humanity and cultures and stuff through time. Very fascinating, a beautiful set. I think they were rather cryptically recorded, though, so they're not as stenographically rich as they normally are. So you get this picture of esoteric history. So here's Steiner reading. Okay, so he wants to talk about Aristotle. So he actually can meet the astral after image, is my way of putting it, of Aristotle in the memory life of the earth. And ask him questions and get answers that Aristotle would give, or that Goethe would give, or that all these beings would give. So that's kind of how Steiner read.
I see. Okay.
So his learning curve is unbelievable.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But he did also have a library of 9,000 volumes in his own private library, which is at the Goetheanum. Now, the point being is that Steiner, being this practical man, richly enculturated by his own society, and in 1870 to 1910 in Europe was one of the highest points of culture in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just think about it for a while. It was staggering what went on then, in science and philosophy and music. I mean, it's unbelievable. Okay. And Steiner grew up in that. So but here he is, as he says, he gets all this direct knowledge from the spiritual world, but he wants to integrate it into the stream of understanding of his fellow human beings who don't have that access. And so he studied books, but not to learn from them, but to find modes of expression and things. You know what I'm saying? So he could integrate the two together and be a better communicator. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah.
So he would say, look, you can actually learn the entire thing of geometry. And then all of a sudden one day you open up a book and go, oh, wow, this guy did this Euclid guy. I'll be darned. He found everything I did. Huh. So that's what Steiner did with the Bible. Mm-hmm. So Steiner found, you might say, everything that's in the Bible. Then he opened up the Bible and went, oh, that's how they say that here. Interesting. Well, nobody's going to know that. Nobody's going to know that's what that means unless they've seen it directly. And that's an excitement to read Steiner's, all of his lecture cycles on the Gospels, by the way. Have you ever read any of them?
Yeah, we recently did another little episode on Steiner with a guy, Aaron French. We did specifically his Christology.
That's cool, isn't it? I mean, and he's always coming at them from, yeah, I already know this, and this is how the Bible says it. Let's talk about that. And I love that. It's flabbergasting, right? I mean, obviously, people are going to get pretty upset, but yeah. So, okay, I'm kind of hedging this situation. So, obviously, Steiner was an initiate of some kind, and in this particular lifetime that he had, he was called upon to, in a certain way, sacrifice his own development and become a public figure.
Yeah.
Okay. And take all that's going to be taken on when that happens. All the vilification, all the attacks, the burning of the first Goetheanum by arson. His life in 1922 and 23 being attempted to kill him through the brown shirts in Germany so that he could never go back to Germany again. Okay, there's an enormous amount of stuff around him that was attacking him. But, he took this on as a mission through his masters that had initiated him. Now, an occultist will never, if they're a healthy occultist, that simply will never discuss this on a public level. They may discuss it in private conversations with people, and that's sort of where we get some of this information. Okay, is only through private things that he said to other people that, in fact, we found out about after those people died, and we studied their letters and artifacts that they left behind them after they died. That's how everything I'm really going to tell you right now, in a certain sense, comes from. Okay. Steiner himself would never stand there and tell you I was this person. The minute anybody says that, walk away. Yeah. Just walk away, because they've just taken your freedom away from you. That's a way to say it, right? I am so great that you have to listen and believe everything I say to you. That's sort of what's behind all that ugliness.
Yeah.
But okay, but at the same time, there was a time that came in the evolution of the Anthroposophical Society, James, when it reached a critical point. Steiner was never a member of the Anthroposophical Society. He was a teacher of the anthroposophical movement, and parallel to that, a bureaucratic administrative structure came into existence called the Anthroposophical Society. And that's where he would go. Those were his people. That's where he would go to give them talks and everything, and show them eurythmy and architecture and everything. But he was the teacher of the movement of anthroposophy. And that had to be. He said that's true of every teacher will do that, because they won't take on that external, exoteric aspect. It depletes their energies and weakens their clairvoyance, their research, their spiritual research. I believe he says it that way. So, but then there was a crisis after the burning of the Gratianum in 1922-23 on New Year's Eve. So it burned from 1922 to 1923, you might say. Okay. So a year later, he decides that he is going to take on the presidency of the Anthroposophical Society and be both the president of the society and also the teacher of the movement still. Okay. So he was very worried when he'd made that decision. He did not know if the higher worlds were going to let that happen, or if he was going to sort of be wounded in his ability to do spiritual research. And after he did it, he was very relieved and happy to share with everyone that no, in fact, the exact opposite has happened. The worlds have even opened up more intensely than they even did before for me, and I'm able to see even more clearly and do my research more efficaciously now. Okay. All right. So during that time, before the Christmas conferences, it was called, sometime around December 24 of 1923 to January 6th of 1924, he gave a couple cycles of lectures that were very interesting when you look back on them. And what he was doing there is he was kind of, in a third person way, describing the spiritual stream from its beginnings all the way back in the time of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the spiritual stream that had come to its eventual flowering in the anthroposophical movement. Okay. And he talks about Eabani and Enkidu, or that's the same person. That's two different ways of saying the same name. And Gilgamesh and the relationship they had. And then later on, he talks about Cratylus and Plato, and then Plato and Aristotle and their relationship. And then he talks about Thomas Aquinas and his relationship with a certain person. And all through this thing, it's very interesting, right? And then later on, you get the impression that these were reincarnations of Rudolf Steiner. But again, it's never, and part of it was, there was a woman named Ida Wegman who was a, what would you say of her? Just powerhouse medical doctor, that she and Steiner worked very much together in medicine. We haven't talked about medicine, but there's thousands of doctors around the world that practice anthroposophical medicine. They become doctors of medicine, and they take 2 years of extended study to become anthroposophical doctors. And that's a very cool thing. So anyway, and this Ida Wegman, he and Ida Wegman then, supposedly it appears, he gave her these kind of cryptic verses. I stand at Tigris and you are blah, blah, blah. And I stand at da-da-da and you are da-da-da. And they're just very cryptic, and people have deciphered them. There's a book called Rudolf Steiner's Mission and Eta Wegman, Wegman, which is sort of this esoteric study, taking these fragments that they found and reworking the reincarnations of Rudolf Steiner as Enkidu or Eabani, as Aristotle, and these are the only ones that he mentions in here. There's probably were other ones, as St. Thomas Aquinas, and then as Rudolf Steiner. Okay, so you could take or leave that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, but then in this lifetime, when he was young, he met a herb gatherer named Felix Kugutsky, who we think was probably a master, though we don't know. Steiner never, other than appreciating the man so much in his autobiography, Steiner's autobiography, where, by the way, he just talks about everybody else. He doesn't talk about himself hardly at all. It's really an amazing thing to read. Who was then introduced to his real master or another master by this Kugutsky guy, who a lot of people feel was probably the reincarnation of Christian Rosenkreuz. Mm-hmm. And Rosenkreuz is the reincarnation of Saint John of the Book of the Revelation. Okay. Who went through many, 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 many reincarnations. About once every 100 years he was born. Okay, and was the first in the modern times of Christ, was initiated by Christ himself. He had been Lazarus, and then in the initiation, as it's described, he becomes John. And that's, again, interesting, because when you read a book of John, you notice that John never says his own name. He says the disciple whom the Lord loved. Mm-hmm. That's all he says through the whole book, right? Interesting. Steiner goes into that, of course, in excruciating and magnificent detail in his lecture cycle on the Gospel of John. And so is this just too crazy? You kind of asked, and I kind of didn't. I kind of didn't want to talk about it.
No, I get it. I think I understand your position, and I think you've given enough to hint at what is beneath that question.
But it's strange how it fits. It's strange how those things, when you read them and you look at what those people do. I mean, think of the influence of Aristotle. Mm-hmm. in our the birth of logic. I mean, logic as a codified understanding permeates the consciousness of all of humanity, and that was given by Aristotle. On top of it all, with most of his stuff gone, we hardly have anything by Aristotle, except for people argue it's probably the notes of lectures and stuff that he gave, because all this stuff, was destroyed, and the stuff that was left over was kept by the Arabs, and then eventually got back to Europe and was translated from the Arabic. Mm-hmm. It's quite a story, you know what I mean? And then Aquinas takes it up and does this whole amazing thing with the intelligences and all this magnificent cosmology that comes out of that. Again, there's all these sides to these people as personalities that are very problematic, no doubt about it. But we're looking more at this esoteric stream that's running through it all. So the argument then is this whole thing really culminated up to our time in this thing called anthroposophy that is, trying to get a foothold on the world and help us see things in a richer, deeper, broader way than the way we do now, and hopefully help us, overcome the crises that are screaming at us to grow up.
Man. Yeah. I think, I have no more to add. It's been a very long conversation. I think it's a good ending to sort of give people a taste of who Steiner is and how deep this all goes and what it's connected back to. But I think, just another opportunity. So it's rudolfsteineraudio.com.
So so there's www.rudolfsteineraudio.com. There's the streaming service. That's rudolfsteiner.podbean.com, which is an app you get for your phone, Podbean. It's awkward to find stuff on there. And then it's also thrown up on a Dale Brunsvold channel on YouTube, but again, not very organized. And then there's also a YouTube channel run by Rudolf Steiner Press out of England that is got everything on it as well, called Rudolf Steiner Press Audio. So there's a bunch of places. And then, of course, on Apple iTunes podcasts on there too. So
I'll be sure to put all these links in the description.
If it matters.
Yeah, Dale Brunsvold, it's been an amazing conversation.
I hope I didn't alienate you there at the end, James. I
No, no, no,
apologize.
no, not at all,
You
not
you,
at
you
all. It's
kind of
just
asked.
no, no, you didn't. No, you didn't
Okay, all right,
alienate. You didn't
okay,
alienate
yeah,
me.
all right.
It's that sometimes you almost you don't know how to respond to such a thing. You know what I mean?
Sure, sure, absolutely. And I don't know any of that's true, you know. It's just stuff you read and think about and wonder about, you know, and fascinating.
Well, I guess the Steinerian response would be it's up to listeners and yourselves to figure out if you believe it.
Or just do the research and the study and grow as a person to have the personal direct experiences yourself, maybe even
Yeah,
a better thing to do. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I don't know about believing, so I don't know what I would
I
do
see what
with
you
that.
mean. Yeah, yeah. We spoke
It's
about
that old story. Yeah, I don't know
that.
what I would, how I would do that and be self-respecting.
Well, yeah,
but
Dale,
but I,
it's been
all right,
fantastic,
sir.
and
Thank you
yeah,
so
thanks
much.
very much.